So welcome back, everyone, to the third session of today's GCDN panels. This one is about a theme which has been explored in previous GCDN sessions, and in particular the session we had in Singapore with the director of Meow Wolf. But this is a different take on that territory, and to moderate the discussion about immersive exhibitions and immersive experiences, I'm delighted to have Christos Carras, who is the executive director of the Onassis Center in Athens, and is also a very active member of GCDN and a substantive contributor to it. So Christos, I will hand across to you to introduce the speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to this.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the panelists for taking the time to engage in this discussion. It's obviously a very interesting subject, a very dynamic subject, and one that is more and more relevant. The immersive experience, let's say, sector in the arts and entertainment is rapidly growing, fueled by new technical possibilities, fueled also by the needs of audiences for different kinds of experiences, audiences who are now connected 24/7, constantly receiving images, sounds, comments, whatever, news, etc., and whose senses are used to being richly stimulated and who welcome this kind of experience. Obviously, it's an interesting subject to see exactly what we mean by immersive productions, not in the sense that we'd like to sort of have a fixed, steadfast definition, because it's an evolving area, but nonetheless, it's important to know when we pitch something as immersive, what do we mean? How do we describe it? Is it really immersive in the way that we lead our audiences to imagine? So it's good to have some kind of handle on what we're talking about. And of course, all this is quite new, relatively new, though not that new, as we will perhaps hear. But certainly we're on a learning curve for this. Opportunities, definitely. Challenges also that need to be understood. Technical challenges, that the production values are extremely high. If they're not, it's often a very disappointing experience. Sustainability challenges, both in the sense of the environmental impact that these productions have, but also sustainability in the sense of their financial viability. Immersion is an expensive sport, and as we continually try and have deeper, bigger, wider immersive experiences, we also have to think about what this means in terms of balancing revenue streams with the production costs that can be very high. And last but not least, aesthetic challenges, artistic challenges. We need to rethink quite radically, I believe, ideas of dramaturgy, ideas about narratives, because the old forms probably don't work in this new universe. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of fascinating discussions and interesting questions that will emerge from the presentations. And I'd like to go straight to our first speaker, who's Geoffrey Marsh, who's done a lot of research work. In fact, he's just produced a paper that I think Adrian will be able to put on the chat, put a link to on the chat, about a certain history and an idea of how this notion of immersion developed right through from the 19th century, in fact, till today. Anyway, Geoffrey Marsh is the director of the V&A's Department of Theatre and Performance. Everyone has heard of the David Bowie Is exhibition, and many of you will have actually had the pleasure of being there, but also You Say You Want a Revolution, and many others. He ran previously the Office of AEA Consulting, was Director of Development at the Imperial War Museum. He has tremendous experience in this field. He's done a lot of research, and it's with great pleasure that I give you the floor, Jeff.
Thank you, Christos. What I'm going to do, because we got some very talented speakers later on the design front, is I'm just going to step back from the world of 2021 and fill in a little bit about the history of the evolution of these things, and as a sort of introduction. And as Christos said, I and Vicky Brokes, who I co-curated these exhibitions with, we've written a summary paper about the development of immersive exhibitions at the V&A, and also a bit of background history. Hopefully that will provide the detail that obviously I can't do in 10 or 15 minutes. I would like to say how delighted I am that Tom Piper's here today, because that paper ends with the Alice Curious and Curious exhibition that's just opened at the V&A in South Kensington in London, which Tom Piper designed and has created a marvelous immersive experience, which I've had absolutely nothing to do with. So that's a great achievement there. So I think that what I wanted to do was step back a bit, and many of the listeners here may be aware of the projects that a French commercial company, Culture Spaces, have done, starting with the Carrière de Lumière at Les Baux in the south of France, and then recently they opened an immersive, similar immersive experience in a factory in Paris, and these are clearly a great commercial success because they're being rolled out. There's one opening in Bordeaux in the old U-boat pens. There's another one in South Korea, and various other ones are opening if you look at their website. And what these essentially do is go back to a project that was started in the 1970s at Les Baux by Albert Plesset, who was a French photographic theorist who took over the caves, and from 1977 onwards did a series of stunning audiovisual presentations in those caves. In around 1990, I was working for an exhibition design company, and the creative director happened to have a house near Les Baux, which meant that each year I could go and see those shows. And they made a deep impression on me, and I think a lot of other museum designers. I think museums and curators were much sniffier about them because they didn't have any real objects in them. These were purely audio-visual extravaganzas, if I can put it that way, coupled with music. So playing on visual and musical methods, sound and vision, as David Bowie would have put it. I don't want to go back too far, but just to say that Plesset and people he worked with, particularly that he knew at the National Theatre in Prague, had developed a lot of these ideas, particularly at the World Expo in 1967 in Montreal, and particularly the Czech pavilion there pioneered some of this technology. And it's, if you're interested in that, it's covered in the paper. And I think it's very interesting to see how the drive of these projects at Expo 67 led to a real creative burst in Montreal and elsewhere in Canada. It was people who worked there that then went off to set up IMAX. And obviously, Montreal is now a center for all sorts of big projection ideas, and of course is a member of the network. So I think these things of technology, the opportunity to use them at World Expos, they all sort of connect together if you look at it in a kind of historical way. Moving on to my own involvement in this, though, having seen what I thought was an astonishingly effective way of communicating with the general public, the real general public, not the elite. I was interested in trying to do this in the United Kingdom. And I think if any of you are interested in this, it's worth looking at the TripAdvisor comments on the Carrière de Lumière in Les Baux, or l'Atelier de Lumière in Paris, because if you've, apart from the fact that they get astonishingly high ratings, 4.55 stars, all the way through there, you'll see these things saying, I saw an advert for this project. It sounded really cheesy. I went, it's astonishing. And I think that's part of the issue that's mixed up in this, that how these things relate to status in the arts, and how things which aren't quite art installations and not quite museums how they are perceived, which I'll come back to towards the end. So in the 1990s, I was the project director for a new branch museum of the Imperial War Museum in Manchester. And working with Daniel Libeskind and Steve Simons, the designer, we stole, however you like to say it, the idea of image totale for something which, excuse me, became the big picture. And if you're in the north of England ever, you can go and see that there. And that's been running very successfully since 2002. I've always been intrigued, given the popularity of these approaches, why they seem to be so shunned by the museum world, or were. Anyway, to cut a long story short, when I started at the Imperial War Museum, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I was interested in trying to do some exhibitions borrowing from these techniques. And one of the things I set out in the attached paper is this wasn't some sort of brilliant idea I had and came up with a sort of fantastic solution. The evolution of these exhibitions took place over more than a decade, involved lots and lots of other people, had enormous help from different technologies and all the rest of it. So when David Bowie is opened in 2013, it was with a huge amount of help and over a considerable period of time. However, I do think that exhibition did mark a really important pivot point, because it showed that big scale AV and music could be integrated together in a museum environment. So just to be absolutely clear, there was no revolutionary technology in that exhibition. The sound system was delivered by Sennheiser's Guideport system, which some of you may be familiar with, which had actually been around, I think, for 10 or 15 years. It just hadn't been picked up by museums very much. And in fact, they were phasing it out. What that allowed one to do was to bring sound alongside objects and audio visuals in very, very precise ways. And I think it was the mixing of that technology together, which was a really unique feature of the exhibition. And I have to say here that I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Andreas and Daniel Sennheiser, who sponsored all the main shows that I did, and gave us a huge amount of technical support. I think they started off thinking they were doing one exhibition in one place, and at one time we're running 3 exhibitions around the world. So a huge thanks. And obviously Sennheiser's obsession with sound quality, because many of you may know them through their work in opera houses and theatres, was also crucial. So David Bowie's went on, it's said, to be the most successful touring exhibition ever outside China. I've never quite worked out whether it got more visitors than the John Paul Gaultier show, but it doesn't really matter. I think what it showed was that combining these things and making exhibitions, I guess, into a kind of event, a must-see event. At the V&A, we had ticket touts, and we actually had forged tickets for the first time, generated different audiences. And there's not time to do it now, but there is good market research data on the different ways that the audiences at the V&A were affected by this sort of approach. Also, what came out at that subsequent exhibitions, I think it was a fairly clear boilerplate that if you had a subject which would get 250,000 visitors or so with this sort of approach, you could make not a huge profit, because with museums you have all the objects and security and things, but certainly sort of, in the region of 500,000. There's a sort of boilerplate there. Much of it obviously depends on the retail, and just to say, the Bowie catalogue sold over 300,000 copies. So it's not just the show itself, it's the fact that people coming to these exhibitions, their retail patterns of behavior are much more like the sort of thing you'll get at a rock concert, where people are coming prepared to spend significant sums of money on a kind of a souvenir of an event rather than a conventional museum exhibition. So that was all running along, and subsequently we did Revolutions, and there was Pink Floyd show and various other things, and Also, Kate Bailey, who's the curator with Tom on the Alice exhibition, did a similar immersive show on opera, on the history of opera, which I think was interesting because some people said that these exhibitions only work with pop stars or that sort of thing. I think the opera exhibition demonstrated that the critical thing was the integration of sound and music alongside objects. So that's very important. And I think Kate and Tom have pulled off something really quite extraordinary with their Alice exhibition, which is, well, you'll have to go and see it. It's almost impossible to describe it. And I'll let Tom perhaps do a little bit on that later. So that's where we are on the museum front. The commercial shows have obviously picked up either from the work we did. So the Rolling Stones did their exhibitionism exhibition, which has been touring, or the development of these Image Total shows into a whole series of shows around the world. And I think I'm right in saying, although I'm not sure where they all are, that there's 4 or 5 Van Gogh shows touring in the States at the moment, and certainly 2 of them are coming to London this autumn. So if you're interested in all this, and if you can get to London, or if you're allowed into London, hopefully, you can see immersive exhibitions at the V&A, Alice, also at the Tate, and 2 Van Gogh exhibitions. So you can see 4 immersive exhibitions at one go if you can get it. Of course, the thing that is the real driver of these commercial shows is that they seem to be pretty profitable. My understanding is that the Atelier de Lumière in Paris has got over 1 million visitors in its first year. It charges €10. It doesn't have any objects in it, so it doesn't have any of those sort of costs. It doesn't have sort of costs of security, so you can do the maths for yourself to see the sort of the commercial potential of this sort of thing, and presumably it's one of the reasons that they're being rolled out so rapidly. And of course, what they have also cracked is the fact that if you do a show in one space, although the spaces they've got are very different, ranging from an underground quarry to a Victorian factory in Paris to an ex-U-boat pen in Bordeaux, given that all this stuff is digital, you can adapt them very quickly. And I think that's a kind of interesting thing when one gets on to the whole issue of sustainability with exhibitions, which I'm not going to talk about, but obviously is going to be a big issue coming up. I think I better end there, just to say 2 final things. One, of course, is that these 2 approaches aren't mutually exclusive. There's overlaps, and also there are commercial shows that people may want to do for non-commercial reasons. So I don't see them as being 2 sort of parallel railway lines. And then the second thing is that there is a third area, which is what you might call the Immersive Art Exhibition, which is obviously a lot of you will probably be familiar with the Rain Room. Super Blue have just opened in Miami with some extraordinary installations, James Turrell and that sort of thing. And as of last night, Es Devlin's Forest for Change, which is an art installation for the London Design Biennale, has opened in Somerset House, which is a sort of external forest that you can walk into in this sort of immersive way. So alongside the sort of 2, the commercial and the sort of mainstream museums, there are an increasing number of these art installations where I guess the art is the subject, but also the technology as well. So to finish on, I think for members who are listening in, who are interested in this, it's a very exciting world. In the paper that's been put up, I've highlighted some of the problems with immersive exhibitions because it's not a one-way street. And I think to end on, I think the big question is whether these immersive exhibitions are a kind of interim technology between conventional museum exhibitions and the consumption of culture at home or on iPhones and all the rest of it on the move. But clearly, at the moment, they offer significant opportunities for cultural districts who may be looking to up their offer as part of a broader cultural mix. I think I'll finish there. So thanks very much, Christos. I'll end there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Yes, indeed, I think it's very interesting that you pointed out that there are very many different approaches to this immersive production. It makes me think of some of the stuff we've done here in Athens at the Onassis Cultural Centre as well, which were definitely on the more, let's say, critical edge of theatrical performances, or performances in general, I would say. I'm thinking of Dries Verhoeven's Phobiarama, which is like a very critical take on the haunted attraction sort of thing, or Rimini Protocol Situation Room, for example. So indeed, there's a whole range of possibilities from the quite edgy and critical right through to the much more accessible and just simply enjoyable, which of course is not a sin in itself. So thank you very much. I think we'll move on now to the next speaker, who is Meredith O'Shaughnessy. Thank you, Meredith, for being with us. She's the founder and creative director of the Meredith Collective, an award-winning experiential architect and creative director who's worked with many very big and very exciting brands to create cross-channel engagement strategies over the past 15 years. She's also apparently known as the pop-up queen of London, which we will leave her to define more accurately in her presentation. And she's been voted a highly commended consultant of the year at the Global Women in Marketing Awards 2019. And recent projects include a 1920s inspired Art Deco themed pop-up bar at the Savoy in London, which I could very much look forward to visiting when I make it over and when Greece has left the orange list. Anyway, until then, Meredith, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christos, and thank you so much, Geoffrey, for such a great kind of introduction to the word of experiential and kind of how that intersects across kind of cultural districts and venues. I thought it'd be interesting kind of to approach it from a slightly different angle. My background isn't actually arts and culture. My background is hospitality. So I do come at kind of experiential from more of the entertainment end of the spectrum. But as we've just discussed, or you've just mentioned, the kind of these worlds are converging, and actually art, culture, entertainment, experience, and people's expectation is developing all the time. And people are looking for new ways to engage with the spaces around them, their city centres, and things that they find kind of interesting. So whether that be kind of film and music, or popular culture in various elements, or revisiting well-known artists and finding and discovering them in a new way. So I thought what might be interesting is to kind of give a bit of an overview of the work that I've done and how I've approached experiential, and where I maybe see it going in the future, and how people might be able to activate it kind of in a local area or with different partners. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope that everyone can see that. Fantastic. So I am, as mentioned, I'm Meredith O'Shaughnessy, and being an experiential designer, I often end up, sorry, it's very noisy here in London, doing slightly strange things like, creating an experience around dolls' houses. So this is what this image represents here. I started out in 2014. In 2014, if you said to somebody that you did immersive experience design, they thought that you were going to put them in a room and have people touch them inappropriately. It was quite a scary thing for people to think about immersive experiences. It felt that things were a little bit more purist. You tended to have kind of a theatre production, or you go to a gallery or a museum. And so it was quite an interesting...
Sorry to butt in, but we can't see anything on your screen. It's gone black for some reason. There's no image there, unless that's what you're showing right now. But there's no image there.
Sorry. Sharing is paused. Bring shared window to the front. Sorry. Can you see that now?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
At least I can't. I'm not sure if the others can.
Let me try again. Apologies.
There we are.
There
That's
we go. Technology. So back then it was an interesting way. You had to really consider how you get funding to bring interesting ideas to life. This is an activation I did called Dirty Laundry, where I worked with Whirlpool because I came up with the idea of creating an immersive laundromat that ran for 5 days, where we converted washing machines into cocktail makers and people could come and they could wash away their sins. And so it was an idea of this kind of new experience that people really hadn't had before. And it was kind of had very mixed reaction. It got a huge amount of press coverage from publications like Vogue and Time Out. It was talked about globally. But some of the people who came to it weren't really sure what they were turning up for. And so there were some Time Out reviews where they were like, I don't know what that was. And I feel like if something like this was put on now, people are much more informed about what an immersive experience is, which is actually really useful for people that are looking to create experiential, because it means that people have a little bit more of a vocabulary or an understanding about what they're going to, and therefore can choose the experiences that they're going to attend. So this is another experience, again with Whirlpool, where I had people walking through domestic appliances. We created an entire narrative here. It was called Keeping Up with the Joneses. I had a family of actors that I cast, and I created a narrative where Mrs. Jones had designed her brand new home and was very proud of it. And as she took you through a massive fridge with oversized packaging, you were then led through different moments and vignettes where you could interact with people. So you walked into a dishwasher where you had a macaron that was in the shape of a dishwasher tablet. You had another room where you had Mr. Jones sitting in a bathtub and we're handing out gin toothpaste. So again, it was one of these things where it was like, how crazy could you let your imagination go? How far could you push the audience? How far could you allow them to interact with something? And also based on original content. It wasn't something where this was existing IP. And I think that's something really interesting to consider. A lot of people, when they're considering putting on experiential, think, does it have to be based on something that already exists? Does it have to be a Bowie exhibition? Does it have to be something that is familiar to people? And I would suggest that investigating these more fringe experiential elements is a really exciting area, and actually people are much more receptive to these sorts of things now. This was something which was a little bit more based upon kind of a food and drink experience. So experiential within cultural areas, I think layering experiences on top of each other is also a really important approach. So this was for California walnuts. I created a walnut orchard in an art gallery attic in Shoreditch, which ran for 5 days. And as we flew in Michelin-starred chefs, and as the evening progressed, the sun moved from a sunlit Californian kind of orchard, as you can see, and the sun set, and we put candles on the tables, and it completely changed the mood throughout the experience. So thinking about not just creating experiences where people are walking through, but actually experiences where people can have an increased dwell time or can have different activities within an experience. If you're thinking about kind of cultural districts, could you have something where people went from one experience in a location such as an exhibition they visited and therefore had a follow-up experience in a local restaurant or a local area that you could go to? Partnering with people that are creatives and experts in their field within your neighborhood. I think with experiential, it's really important to be thinking about how you connect people to a sense of place and not just copy what other people are doing. Something that may have worked in Paris doesn't necessarily translate to something that's happening in London, and nor should it. We need to be creating our own identities. We need to be creating our own narratives with these things, because while there has been a huge number of very successful touring exhibitions, people are also looking to connect with the local area. They're looking to connect with storytelling. They want to know the narrative of the place. And when you travel, the things you remember, the things you talk about, are actually the things where you found that little restaurant around the corner, or you went and did something that was really special that nobody else had access to. So not just thinking about creating experiences which are generic. I'm very much about trying to push those boundaries and really creating moments in time for people. This is another activation I did in Burlington Arcade. So this was a month-long pop-up, actually partnered with an English sparkling wine called Nye Timber, and it created an immersive retail store. Now, the reason I thought this might be interesting is actually Experiential is excellent at driving footfall. So it doesn't just drive footfall to the experience, it also really drives footfall to the local area. And I think that's another really valuable thing about Experiential. It's like it's important to be thinking beyond just who am I within this space and what do I want and who do I want to come to this, but also how are you benefiting the people around you. So Experiential, that is a destination that gets a lot of press, that's, you know, Instagrammable, which is the word that, you know, everybody's after. It's also incredibly important for potentially cities that are looking to reinvigorate themselves. So I think this is, you know, another reason to think about experience also within void units. So one of the big challenges as an independent experiential designer is actually location. So if you have access to a location, that's fantastic, but if you're looking to do something creative, usually the cost of a venue is one of the most expensive line items on your budget. So actually with these void spaces coming up, and, you know, as we know, there's a huge number because of the pandemic of changing of tenancies within kind of many cities around the world. And actually, is this an opportunity for experientialists, for creatives to be popping up? And what partners could they be working with? Could it be that you are then spreading your narrative beyond your museum or your gallery and actually getting your message out about the things that you do in a new and engaging way? I know with the Royal Opera House last year, they created a pop-up store in Covent Garden, and they said it really drove footfall and raised awareness of what they do. But in my opinion, we could always go further. It would have been a fully immersive experience if it had been handed over to me, because I think people are looking for texture. They're looking for these really wow moments. And as we move into a more digital age, as we look at everything through these kind of vignettes and everything we consume is in screens and through our phones, actually being able to immerse people in a physical environment where they have a 360 view on something is really special. It's not something we get to do a huge amount anymore. So there's a real opportunity to create kind of these moments that people are going to remember and talk about in the future. So I would mention briefly, this is Solus at Savoy, which I created in rather hurry a few months ago. I was called as soon as the government announcement the government announced that we were able to dine outside again, and had 5 weeks to turn around a show-stopping experience that was going to drive footfall back into London and also get people to rethink about booking kind of at the Savoy Hotel and other grand hotels in London. This was in partnership with Bowmore Whiskey. The centrepiece is this 5-metre wide chandelier, which was inspired by the crashing Scottish waves onto the rocks where Bowmore is aged, and has all sorts of touch points in it. Now, for me, this could be even more experiential. I wanted to have speakers with this waves crashing sound when people were sitting down. They serve a lot of oysters, having scenting around you, changing, the lighting does change from day to night, but always thinking about how do we create these moments that people want to talk about, that people want to come to. And it's been hugely successful. They're completely sold out, and has actually driven footfall, as I mentioned, into the local area, and also, you know, helped the Savoy fill their suites and fill their rooms with domestic travellers. And I think especially for large cities and for some of the people in the network, it's really important that we have a sense of a revigoration, that we're coming back to life again after, you know, a terrible year of being in lockdown, and that people have places to safely connect again, to create community and have these moments of joy. And there's a real opportunity for Experiential now to be that solution to bring people back together again. So I'll just go back up and I'll talk about the next slide before I go into it. So we're thinking in terms of how could you take experiential beyond a singular location and actually have it across a wide area? And actually the project that I was working on at the beginning of last year that was looking, we're in conversation to take it live in Hong Kong, and I was working with DIT, the Department of International Trade here in the UK, to come up with a solution for citywide experiential. Because often when people think about experiential, they're thinking about you have to go to this particular point, you have to go to this particular moment, and actually sometimes that loses a sense of discovery. So the solution I came up with was the idea that Hong Kong is based on scenting, the perfume bay, and could we create moments which actually represented each area in Hong Kong and the different districts of Hong Kong. Now the idea was, it mentioned before, sustainability is incredibly important, using found objects, using recycled objects, having a sense of community. So working with local artists to design pods or arches which represented each area, and then having a perfumer design a specific scent that represented that specific district. You could then have an add-on talking about selling the Bowie books as a memento. Could you have a memento of the scent that people could take away afterwards and remember their experience afterwards? So this was something that we were looking into, and what might something like this look like? Well, you've had a bit of a preview, but this is a rough slide of something where we were actually looking at an area which is all around digital and computers, and one might naturally think, okay, well, we need to put up a lot of screens, we need to be very, very LED heavy here. But I would counter actually that people are looking for texture, they're looking for physical moments that they feel that they can interact with. And this was an example of something that you could then walk through, you could photograph it, you could share it, it would be centered, there'd be sound. So a fully immersive outdoor experience that would lend itself really well to kind of our post-lockdown life, where people are looking to actually be on the streets, looking for ways to interact, but also drive tourist engagement and have people potentially coming back into Hong Kong when the time is right. So just an example of how one can think about experiential on the street, experiential that isn't specifically location based, and experiential which is scalable. And I think that's really a really interesting point, is thinking about all the different levels and sizes that these things can be. So that was let me stop sharing the screen. So those were the elements that I want to talk about. I also think touching on sustainability was incredibly important, and we were having a conversation over email prior to this talk about sustainability and how that might be approached. And I think using interesting materials and thinking about, with these experiences, could you have something that in itself is being recycled or reused as part of the experience, or degrading in a really interesting way? Because people are incredibly captivated by these ideas. People really want to be part of something and interact. And I think a lot of Tom's work is about that. It's actually people interacting with an experience. And I think that's really valuable for people. They really take away something important from that.
Well, thanks a lot, Meredith. Before we go on to Tom, I just want to ask you a quick question. I mean, it seems to me that as in our experience these days, where we're constantly shifting seamlessly from just consuming something to consuming an artwork to watching a movie, to all these constant shifts of registers of aesthetic experience. And I was wondering whether in the work that you've been doing, you've thought of combining in some of these experiential environments, also including an art dimension in them in some way or form.
So I'm including art dimension, I'm very interested in actually collaborating with artists in the experiential kind of projects that I work on, and actually had designed something with an amazing artist who creates wire and paper birds. And I created it was a huge mobile which was a reflection upon migrating birds and endangered birds, and these they were essentially, the feathers were made out of paper, and the more they fell off the birds, the more endangered it showed that they were. And people could come into a bar and they could bird watch up in kind of the top where this mobile was going to be, and then you'd have like the bird song, and you would have scenting. And so I think working with local artists is incredibly important, and working and thinking about also, for people that are interested, how can you make art more experiential, even if it's with original art. There's an incredible woman called Morag who creates pavilions, and every time I look at them I want to add on to them with elements where there's scenting and there's engagement, rather than just passively observing. And so that's where experientialists and people that understand kind of logistics and haptics and how to bring things to life can really partner with artists in a really effective way.
Thanks a lot. Tom, our third speaker for on this panel. It's already been mentioned that the Curiouser and Curiouser show has just opened to stellar reviews. Can't wait to see that as soon as possible. Tom Piper is a theatre designer, associate designer with the Royal Shakespeare Company. He's been involved with the Royal Shakespeare Company from 2004 to 2014, working with a whole range of architects in the Courtyard Theatre and the new TOP Theatre, and with others on the award-winning new RST in Stratford. He's a creative associate at the Kiln Theatre and has collaborated with Alan Farley in the acclaimed British Museum exhibition Shakespeare Staging the World, and many other things. As I think it was either Adrian or Jeff mentioned, perhaps the work that's most known to the broader public was the installation of Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red, which commemorated the outbreak of the First World War at the Tower of London, with 888,246 ceramic poppies, each one commemorating a death in the Great War. So, Tom, over to you.
Hi there. Thank you very much for having me, and it's a really fascinating discussion so far. I guess I come to this from a slightly different angle, in that I'm primarily a theatre designer, and so I spent most of my career inside buildings with a fixed audience, sort of trapped for the 3 hours passage of the play. And it's only in the last sort of 10 years I've started to get involved in things that I would say are more sort of unconventionally experiential. And I suppose the first one, which has been mentioned there, and I'll try sharing the screen, hopefully I probably will have exactly the same experience as Meredith, because that's the kind of thing that happens to me when I do this. Okay. So here we are. I think what I'll do is I'll leave them at the side, because when I press play, it normally goes disastrously wrong. So you can see that there are 10 images coming up. So this was Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red, which I worked on and I am at heart really a collaborator. It's one of the things that theatre teaches you, really, about being a jack of all trades, master of none, working with a range of other talented people to bring to life a vision that's kind of bigger than your one personal contribution. So in this project, I was working with the ceramic artist Paul Cummins, and his original plan was to fill the moat of the Tower of London with ceramic poppies. And when I was brought on board initially, actually in a more kind of logistics sort of fashion, to be, how on earth are we going to do this? I started saying, well, can we engage the poppies with the building? Are we allowed to, make an intervention? And I actually did that because I thought that people wouldn't know it was there. It sounds ironic now because 5 million people saw it in the flesh, but actually at the time I thought that the moat of the Tower of London is hidden, no one can see it, so I'll create some wayfinding sort of moments. So this one, Weeping Window, you can see from when you come out of the tube station, so it was kind of like drawing people in. But it also brought, which I think theatre designers do very well, which is bring metaphor to an event. So Paul had the idea of ceramic poppy representing one life, but I brought to the installation the metaphor of the poppies behaving as a liquid and behaving like blood, so them kind of pouring out of the building. And actually what this whole installation sort of developed in a very haphazard reactive way. There was a point about a month before we were due to start where we thought it wasn't going to happen because we felt we've discovered that we just couldn't make enough poppies in time. And actually what that did was transform it into not just an art happening, because what we thought we were going to do was secretly put all these poppies in the moat and then reveal them to the world, all fully finished. And actually it became an experiential event, because actually the creating of it had to be public and had to be part of the event itself. And what you saw was that we had over the course of the life of it, 20,000 volunteers came. And those volunteers became unwittingly the performers in the event. And they were having their own deeply immersive experience. There were often people from military charities, people meeting each other, sharing stories about relatives. So they were having a kind of personal history sort of event happening there, and took their role very seriously, planting the poppies. Meanwhile, you can see on the walls of the moat, an audience started watching them and actually would just sometimes applaud them. So that it became this sort of almost unconscious piece of performance art in which the volunteers were the performers and were completely immersed in it. And this took place over 3 months until we had all of them planted. And that led me to do another installation that the Tower invited me to do at the end of 18 to kind of mark the end of the First World War. And I guess this is, as Meredith was saying, this is a kind of unique opportunity to do this in the Tower of London. You couldn't duplicate it anywhere else. All the poppies were sold to raise money for charity, so it's unrepeatable. But it was definitely a response to that situation, that particular commemorative memorial kind of event. And actually, the poppies then went off on a tour funded by 1418 Now. We took 2 sculptural pieces and went to 18 different venues around the country. And in each one of those, the impact was extraordinary, kind of on the local community, bringing this art event into a place like Woodhorn Mining Museum, for example, increased their visitor numbers by 1,500%. And, sort of, and the cafe revenue was massive. And then, so for 18, I did a sort of a development of this idea, which was to create an installation of light that began with one single light being lit, carried into the space in a theatrical gesture by a yeoman warder. And then again, recruiting volunteers. We had 60 pairs of volunteers who all filed into this space and gradually started lighting up these flames, so that over the course of a 3-hour period, the flames kind of grew. And the audience, some who could get tickets, could actually go and walk around the moat while this was happening. And we collaborated with the sound artist, Meredith O'Shaughnessy, who created a whole score for this piece, but equally some members of her kind of dance troupe are walking through the audience as they're walking around. They had speakers hidden within them, so that the sound was actually coming at you from the people around you. So again, a very kind of immersive sort of event. And I wanted to contrast that with a much more kind of lower key kind of thing, which is a consultancy I've done at the Story Museum in Oxford, which is an interesting kind of concept, because it is a museum in a sense without that many artifacts. It does have books, but fundamentally its subject matter is story, and how do you tell story? And part of the museum space is an enchanted library space, which was all made mainly out of saved and found sort of quirky bits of architecture that the curator had saved for years in Oxford in a container, and all had to be baked and then put in. And then within this library, there were a series of little immersive rooms, so that you could go through the wardrobe, and you could go into Narnia, and then you'd be in the little kind of Narnia environment. There was a video there of the fawn kind of and a soundtrack, so that you would actually engage the children right directly into a little snippet of narrative. So there are 10 rooms in this space, each one with a different bit of story. There's Alice, there's a Winnie the Pooh, which is actually inspired by the Winnie the Pooh exhibition I did with Alan Farley at the V&A. But it's an example of a kind of, and their budget is tiny, so it really is kind of like fringe theatre of museum making, but it's creating these immersive spaces where people can come and kind of share and get into a story. And then I'll take you sort of finally onto Alice, which has been spoken about. And this I guess, for me, I think the interesting challenge as a designer of exhibitions, especially exhibitions with objects, is how do you respect those objects within the context of your design? How do you allow your own imagination to take flight, but leave space for the objects as the actors in the play, so to speak, to tell their story, and also allow the audience or the visitor to engage in their imagination so that they can take flight. So you're not actually giving them everything. And so this is the entrance to the exhibition. And we went, I mean, part of the problem with Alice in Wonderland is it's such a familiar story. There's so many, Pinterest posts about it. But we went back to Oxford and looked at the Oxford of Lewis Carroll, went to Christchurch, and the initial thing was like Christchurch Library with the pages of the book kind of exploding. And on the right there, you can see there's a fragment of a riverscape made out of old Victorian photographs. And the kind of light bluey bit you can see there is actually a bit of Luke Hall's video, which sort of the text kind of floats in. And these pages then float into the next gallery and draw you into the space, and they carry on through. Then within the, I won't show you all of them, you'll have to go into the exhibition, but we've created various kind of immersive experiences, like this is the Tea Party, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. And it begins with, it's inspired by the Jonathan Miller film from 1966, which is in black and white and is contrary to the sort of the notion of a wacky psychedelic 60s. It's actually more like a sort of Beckettian take on Alice's adventures, where all of the Mad Hatter and the Dormouse are basically Oxford dons who are kind of boring her to tears at the tea party. So the tea party begins with this film on one side, and it's all in black and white. And then it's as if the table has been taken by a kind of a mad kind of wind, and chairs have flown up into the air. And then gradually the tea table becomes more and more psychedelic, riddles start appearing on it. And this was a kind of 2-minute video sequence that we designed with Luke Hall's. Initially, it was going to be more interactive in that, pre-COVID, and that we thought people would be able to touch plates and send the dormouse running around. But in fact, what we've ended up is it kind of gives the illusion of that in a sense you feel that you are able to interact with it, but actually you aren't. And I think that's one of the interesting things in exhibitions is, what is interaction? We always think of interaction being buttons to press or levers to turn, but actually, just staying and looking at a painting, it's interacting with it. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when designing exhibitions, where you're trying to create a variety of experiences, that actually you don't forget that the simple act of just looking is a very important experience, or even just listening. There is within it a kind of a VR section where there are 6 sort of VR stations where you can play virtual croquet with virtual flamingo and hedgehogs. And this initially was going to be a very simple immersive experience with kind of real croquet, well, real plastic flamingos and little furry balls. And I actually rather loved the idea of lots of kids rampaging through the museum with decapitating people with their flamingos. But we ended up with, late in the day in the exhibition design process, with a sponsorship to do this bit. So this sort of came in kind of midway through the design process, and we sort of adapted it. And here you can see that that's a sort of mad rose garden, slightly reminiscent of my poppy sculptures as well, really, these kind of roses that go from red to yellow. So I haven't yet been in the exhibition because of COVID when people have been using this. So I don't actually know what it does to the audience flow. And actually, I've never done it yet. So I think it illustrates for me part of the problem of investing in solely an individualistic VR experience within an exhibition, that actually there's only 6 stations, and what's the queuing going to be like, and how long are people going to do it? And there's obviously, you can see in the background there, someone's put a hand sanitizer in, which wasn't there when I was there, but there's a little yellow hand sanitizer. And then the final image here is the Cheshire Cat Room, which is the psychedelic sort of space, again illustrating that tension and balance between actually wanting to create space for the works of art to breathe, so actually calmer walls for those works in, and then the kind of this mad psychedelic forest with a projection of the Cheshire Cat sort of that comes and goes from the top of this sort of cylindrical tree. And so I guess that sort of sums up the balance of that I've been trying to achieve throughout it, but I couldn't do it without the kind of brilliant collaborators that people like Luke Hall's video and Zelina in the lighting, and Gareth Fry, another brilliant theatrical sound designer, has created a wonderful soundscape which all kind of beds into the kind of immersive feel of the exhibition. So I kind of hope we managed to straddle this thing between, yes, there is an experience, but there is also art and narrative, and the objects have to tell a story and talk to each other across the exhibition, which is what we were hoping to do. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Tom. Really can't wait to see the show at the V&A. I'm glad you mentioned, the Oxford Story Museum as an example of a small space that doesn't have the budgets of the size of the V&A or other major museums, because I think one of the issues that we're facing, generally speaking, coming out of the pandemic with the whole shift to digital, is the possibility of a kind of new divide between organizations that can cope and those that can't with new technologies. There was a report by the Network of European Museum Organizations that came out, I think, in November 2020, which showed a very, very clear divide between the larger organizations that had managed to accomplish a digital shift during the pandemic, and those smaller ones, often regional, local ones, that really had a hard time coping. And obviously what we're talking about here is in the same kind of vein, also a problem. Do you think that there's a risk of, let's say, really a two-tier system emerging, even more than there is now, because there already are museums with larger budgets than others, obviously. But do you think there's a risk of this becoming exacerbated as a divide, let's say?
Yeah, I think there could be. I think the success of the Story Museum is actually that it is tangible, and there are physical things that are there. So actually, one of their most popular things is a giant bed, that everyone gets on a giant bed and reads a story on a giant bed, and children just find that kind of magical and wonderful. And I think for me, because I deal all the time in theatre in real spaces, and I don't necessarily use much video technology. I think in a way it's like, often if it's used unimaginatively, it's like kind of 19th century scene painting. I prefer theatre artists who use video like Robert Lepage in kind of brilliant imaginative ways and interacting with the human being. So I think if you always go back that it's the human being's experience and then being with other human beings, and the Story Museum, mainly small ones, but there's something kind of wonderful about that shared community and shared communal space. And I think for smaller scale places, it's about, like the best of small scale theatre, really being very inventive and imaginative with your limited resources, rather than trying to emulate. And often I feel that's why the Story Museum has used a lot of theatre designers, because in a sense we're very cheap actually compared to exhibition designers, and we'll often make things ourselves. So they're used to working with those kind of people. So I think it's actually an opportunity for great physical creativity and people being very resourceful and recycling things, rather than seeing it as trying to always compete with, because fundamentally you can never compete with what people have got on their phone. Their phone is better than the technology that you can afford to put in.
True. I'd like to ask all of you a question. It's not, as I said at the beginning, it's not about defining experiential, but trying to see what makes something, there's probably a range of things that make something an experiential experience. I mean, I was sorry about that. Experiential experience was not a very good term. But anyway, I remember when we did hear a production by Simon McBurney, The Encounter, which maybe some of you have seen. There, let's say the immersive dimension was fundamentally sound. Otherwise, it was a pretty standard stage production. But I found that to be an immersive experience, even though it was only the sound that was playing, or some installation works that are only visual or in, let's say, an environment are immersive too. So I'd like to hear your take of all three of you. What's the tipping point that takes it a step beyond just being a sort of a rich experience to be something that's really experiential in that sense? Geoff, would you like to start with that? Geoff has frozen.
Am I okay now? Can you hear me? Yeah. I think the key thing is, I don't want to be too black and white about things, but I think sound is critical, and within sound, music. I think music, we know how it works in film and all the rest of it. It's got this extraordinary power, and quite why it works the way it does in exhibitions is something that I haven't seen any research on. But I actually think, and I think this goes back to things that Meredith mentioned, the critical thing is actually the audience. what they bring to it, which of course you never know what that is. And I don't mean interactivity, it's just what's inside people's heads, and that's the magic of it. To me, and I think Tom mentioned this in relation to the Story Museum, it's triggering, it's not telling people. These are not didactic exhibitions where they're trying to ram information to people's brains who don't want it, although, you know, it should have information in it. What it's trying to do is trigger emotional experiences in the way that theatre or opera does in other types of spaces. And when it works, it's extraordinary. And you know, one of the weird things in both the Bowie and the Revolution show, and also in Pink Floyd, was that people were singing in the exhibition completely unconscious, you know, not embarrassed at all, and were dancing. And I think that's kind of interesting. In the Revolutions show, we had a sort of evocation of Woodstock festival in 1969, and you know, I went in there once, and there were people not only singing and dancing but crying. I'm not, you know, it's with the intensity of it. And you know, you've seen that in opera as well, and you know, in concerts and music concerts. So I think it's a complex mix, and I do think one of the crucial things, and I think at the V&A, was bringing in theatre designers who are just used to the fact that a performance isn't a performance without the audience. It's a rehearsal. So much of what goes on in museums is just one side. It's what's on the stage, and so often I think museums forget about people, and it's the people that are key, and that magic moment when they become engaged.
Meredith, what's your take on this?
Well, my initial thought is, do we need to define it? Like, surely, you know, it can be what people want it to be. And actually, I think that the worlds of experiences are merging together, as I kind of mentioned before. But there is an argument to suggest that, you know, immersive experiences are about transformation. Now, whether that means we've been physically involved in something, or we're changed in some way when we pass through an experience. Very practical level, one could argue that it needs to engage all the senses and the different, however many senses you could layer on it. Is it possible that if you listen to something that was sound based, could it have been better if there was also a scent element there? Could it have been better if the temperature changed in the room? Could it have been better if you had transitional spaces on either side? So one could always add more or take away something to not overwhelm people. But I think the point about audiences, actually what's really interesting about designing spaces is you never really know how people are going to behave in them, and that's really exciting. I mean, it's utterly terrifying when you first open something, because you are sort of kind of throwing the doors open and say do what you will, but people will constantly surprise you and light you and bring some of themselves to an experience. And I think that certainly within exhibitions that I've been to where I felt like I wanted to be in it more, I wanted to have more that I could do. How could I be Alice? How could I be, you know, this person? And I think that's what we're trying to achieve, is we're trying to fully immerse somebody in a moment in time, or a narrative, or a new, you know, physical realm that they haven't had before, and go away feeling different and hopefully better about themselves and the world.
Thanks. Tom?
Difficult to add much more to both of those answers. They're brilliant. I mean, I think, yes, the audience for me is key. And I guess one of the problems that I sometimes have in exhibitions is that there are too many people, you know, and you're too crowded, and how you can actually really immerse yourself in that space. And I don't yet know whether my Alice exhibition is successful from that point of view, because of course the reviews are from people who went around on their own without lots of other people in there. You know, I'm hoping that people will still have the ability to lose themselves. And I guess also I'm always really keen in theatre too that the visitor engages in their own imagination. That yes, it's immersive, but they can feel and see something from their own self. So that actually it's not, for me, the same as being in a completely sort of a projected world. For me, there has to be physicality and the space for your imagination as well.
I mean, all three of you have accumulated tremendous experience, really cutting edge experience in really creating what this field is today. It's obviously been new, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's clear that narratives and dramaturgies are different. This traditional forms don't work in the same way, or don't work at all. Do you think there's a need, as has been in the past, for education, their university departments, their theatre studies departments, etc., etc.? Do you think that there's a need to really sit down and try and create the means for younger people entering this field to reflect upon what immersion means for dramaturgy and narratives, and actually creating this? Are we at a stage when we can actually do that? Is there enough experience to really pass on something to the next generation in a more formal sense? Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I would say, actually, I think probably most theatre departments are pretty good at that already. I think the area that I find it most absent in is actually in architecture. I mean, the classic architectural drawing never has any people in it, or if they are, they've been kind of stuck on from a kind of Photoshop box and sort of wandering around the outside. Meredith mentioned this thing about we've got all these high streets. I mean, not just in this country, but all over the place. So I think there's what fascinates me is sort of the crossover almost between landscape art, the classic sort of Richard Long, James Turrell, etc., and the more interesting edges of architecture, where buildings are not just a block sitting on a piece of land, but are more integrated into cityscapes. And I just think there's a huge area there, and I'm sort of slightly stunned, about how little seems to be done in that area. I mean, there's lots of proposals by kind of radical architects, but there's not kind of very many things. I'm very intrigued by the proposals to green the Champs-Élysées. I mean, I realize the Champs-Élysées is a huge piece of sort of classical design, but you'd have thought somewhere in that there could be some things which actually disintegrate that approach, because it was made for a particular period. One of the interesting things, I'll just finish on with Es Devlin's Forest for Change, which is currently just been installed at Somerset House, was that my understanding is when Somerset House was built in the late 18th century, that it was not allowed to put any plants or anything in the, because Somerset House was meant to represent the triumph of man. This was very 18th century, over nature, which at that time was, of course, seen as wild and nasty and horrible. And in a sense, what Es is trying to do is not just come up with an idea to promote change, but is actually saying we have changed. In a sense, this is the first time that plants have actually been put back into this extraordinary classical courtyard. So yeah, so I'd hope to see more of it in architecture.
Meredith, do you think we're at a stage where we can actually start communicating and teaching these technologies, these approaches?
I mean, I think people that are. I mean, I'm an expert in formal courses. That isn't the route that even I took. But I think that as technologies are being developed, as people are going to more experiences, and they're seen to be successful, they're therefore getting more funding, they're getting more interest. You mentioned Es Devlin and the amazing work she's done, and the Super Blue, and when people carve a path and therefore it's successful, what automatically happens is more people come in and more learnings are shared, and there's some really exciting stuff happening all over the world. And I think to touch on Geoffrey's point around kind of placemaking and cities, I'm incredibly interested in how experiential and our general life, how experiential can improve cities, and with nature, could it be even more than putting trees somewhere? Actually, can we make it so that those are immersive experiences that give people an emotional connection with a location? I think we're just at the very start of where we can go with this, and how it can actually improve people's well-being and bring people together, and help arts and culture in general. So I think it's very exciting times, and lots of people are writing lots of reports, which is great.
And Tom, do you think there's an interest here in transferring knowledge from one sector to the other? For example, from theatre design to exhibition design. We had a question a bit like that on the Q&A. Is there this kind of knowledge transfer to be done in a more formal way?
Yeah, I think a lot of courses now are training designers to be designer makers initiating their own work. We used to traditionally be the ones who would wait for the phone call and work with the director, and now people are beginning to do their own stuff and transfer those skills across, because I think we have to. It's such a poorly funded field, theatre, and in a way, one of the reasons I do exhibition design is I get paid a bit more than I do when I do theatre, and actually it's sort of and I think those skills of being resourceful with limited resources are going to be increasingly important, to be able to create sustainable installations and all of that. And I think there is a really interesting challenge about the development of technology versus the kind of hands-on craft, so that you are getting people who are now incredibly skilled in computer packages and all that sort of stuff, but have they got the dramaturgical imagination? And that's, for me, is where theatre designers are brilliant, because we do have that imagination, which and we can always find people who are better at the technology than we are.
Thanks, Tom. Actually, you answered a second question that popped up as you were speaking about lowering the barrier of entry for emerging practitioners. So that was super efficient. 2 questions in one go. Well done. And just to round it off, because we have only 2 minutes left, I'd like very quickly your quick intuitive take on what the next steps are. Geoff.
Well, I just say, I realize designers have to be paid, but creativity itself is free. And I think that's the answer when about smaller, poorer institutions. It's about opening your thinking process up to just creative thinking. I think that's at the core of it. I think we could be in for a really, really interesting period. And I think that above all, it's about placemaking. It's concentrating on people. And people, without people, all these things are just dead. And I think that's where the concentration is, that the connection between creativity and engaging people's interest.
Thank you. Meredith, what's next?
Wow. Lots of amazing things. We haven't touched too much on kind of the tech aspect of things, but I'm really interested in where the tech and the physical meet, and actually where you can overlay these experiences so that actually people are able, so it's not one or the other, and that we start looking at those merging, as Tom touched upon, of the kind of the storytelling element and this tech that's being developed, and also looking at experiential as a way to engage people and communicate with people beyond your location or that particular exhibition, and actually creating, having an experiential strategy in the longer term with how do we want to engage people in an ongoing way, in an experiential way, so they keep coming back to us. Ultimately, with experiential, we're designing delight. And how do you put that front and center when creating these moments for people? Because that will draw people back over and over again.
Thanks. Tom, a final parting shot from you.
Well, I would say in the post-COVID world, we're desperate to get back into shared spaces with other people, but also where we will be able to travel less, actually reinvigorating a city with continually new experiences like this is actually a really ecologically sound way of sort of bringing people, making it local, making your local environment really exciting, and a place that you're constantly changing that you want to go into. I think that could be a really good future.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look forward to, and the perspectives are wide open. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you all. Thank you very, very much for taking the time. Thanks to Adrian and GCDN for organizing this. Adrian, over to you for a closing remark.
Very little to say, just to thank you, Christos, for a really compelling panel. To Tom, to Meredith, to Jeff. I need one thought that we've described it as being early days in immersive experiences, but Jeff's paper takes us back to the 19th century, I think. And although Jeff isn't from the 19th century, Bowie was 8 years ago. So I think that one of the interesting things is how slowly actually advantage is taken of the opportunities, whether they're of technology, but they're not so much, they're partially technology, but really it's the opportunity of exploring all sorts of interesting subjects in interesting and compelling ways. And it may well be that museums have issues around the development of that, and therefore one of the great things about a lot of this territory is it can take place and be developed outside of the traditional structures of museums, because all the concerns that one has around conservation standards, etc., are slightly changed in the sort of context of these exhibitions. So there is the potential for organizations like cultural districts to explore this territory in a way that accelerates the development. And it does appear that many of these exhibitions are in the sweet spot of potentially generating surpluses. I won't say profits, I'll say surpluses, of being extremely popular in their content, compelling a broad visitor base, and of real explanatory power, if you like, and real as well as emotional power. So that's if people are wondering why is GCDN talking about immersive exhibitions, that's partly why. Anyway. Thank you all again, and thank everybody who's listening to this now and who will be listening to it. And for both this panel and for the previous two, that's been a great day. This is Adrian Ellis, Chair of the Global Cultural Districts Network, signing off with thanks to panelists and listeners. Take care.
Thank you.